a U.S. military ship has set sail for the coast of Gaza. It's carrying equipment to build a temporary pier to help distribute aid supplies. The Pentagon has said the operation will take 60 days and will use 1,000 troops. President Biden has confirmed, though, that there will be no US boots on the ground, i.e., in the military offensive sense. Joining me now is Major General Tim Cross, a military logistics expert. Welcome to the show, Major General Tim Cross.
Thanks very much. Nice to be with you.
Thank you for coming on. Tell us about how one builds a temporary pier. Can it really be done in 60 days, and what can it do?
I think it can be done in 60 days. As a brigade commander, my brigade built and ran refugee camps in Kosovo for about 50 or 60,000 people. And that was in the land. And, the logistics for that, therefore, were, in that sense, easier. Gaza clearly has got an issue in terms of it hasn't got the scale of the land operation is not sufficient at the moment for all sorts of security reasons. They've been airdropping supplies. So this idea of opening up some sort of temporary port, I think is a good one. I think some people have said, it won't happen, but I think if the Americans are determined to do it, it will. The ship's got to get there. I think it will. I was surprised it would take 60 days, as I say, but nonetheless, it will. They can establish it. The issue is, how much difference will it really make? I mean, I mentioned 50 or 60,000 that we were looking after in Kosovo. There's talk of well over 500,000 Gazans who are seriously in trouble here, and we're talking about having to move in medical supplies, shelter, food, water, and subsequently rebuilding, or the ability to rebuild the place. And I don't quite know what the Americans mean by a temporary port. These temporary things have a habit of becoming much longer than that. They're very capable. The Americans have got a lot of kit, and this particular ship, the support ship, is a very capable ship. I'm a bit surprised. At one stage I was hearing people saying they're not going to put anybody on the ground. Well, I think you've got to have people on the shore to help set this thing up. So issues like security of that, what will Hamas do about this? What will the Gazan people do about it in the context of watching stuff coming ashore? Because there have been problems of convoys being, well, I wouldn't say attacked, but nonetheless, looted and so forth. So there are lots of inevitably unanswered questions, unintended consequences here. But in principle, along with the land movement, the airdrops and so forth, I think this is a very helpful move.
And so what kind of ships will be able to dock in the port that the Americans are planning to build? I mean, you're talking about the huge amount of potential supplies that will have to be supplied to 500,000 Gazans in terms of medical supplies and food, obviously, and presumably temporary shelter as well. Yeah. I mean, they're going to need vast ships to be able to dock at this temporary port.
Well, I mean, actually, the only sort of historical precedent that I can see for this is the Mulberry Harbours for D-Day.
I was thinking about exactly them, which lasted much longer than they were expected to, didn't they?
They were. And the problem was that they needed to establish these temporary ports because we, the Allies, couldn't guarantee on capturing Cherbourg or the other ports that were there, that could be used subsequently. And if you remember, those two, there were two Mulberries established. One of them, there were very severe storms relatively quickly after D-Day, and one of those ports was destroyed, and Mulberry was badly damaged. But Mulberry was a big port. I mean, I did the 50th anniversary of D-Day for all sorts of reasons, and you can still see quite a chunk of the old port. Now, my sense is that what the Americans are building here is not for big, container ships. This will be for relatively small stuff coming in on a continuous basis. But the ship is coming in from Cyprus, for example. I'm not sure where they're going to offload that and how they're going to offload it. And that's an EU ship, is my understanding. So I think the answer is it will be built to sufficient scale to allow ships of sufficient size to dock, but it is not going to be the equivalent of a major port facility. That's just inevitable.
I know. Well, Gaza must have its own ports. I'm confused as to why the Americans aren't using those. It may be for security reasons. What kind of material will they use to build a port like this? Do they drop huge chunks of concrete into the sea and build it up that way? How do you build a temporary port?
No, it's a floating port. As to the ports in Gaza, my understanding is there are at least one. I think there's two or three actually. But my understanding is that they're not usable at the moment. Now, why they're not usable, I don't know. Whether they've been attacked or temporarily destroyed or whatever. But this one will be a floating bridge, in inverted commas, which you can build from the ship forward. But at some point, you've got to put people on the ground. I would offer to secure it and so forth. But you don't have to drop, big concrete blocks and so forth. Mulberry was an extraordinary piece of engineering. But it was made out of huge chunks, which were then sunk onto the onto the seabed. My understanding is that this is not. Well, I know the Americans, will have a floating bridge, which again means you've got to think about the weather, and is that likely to have an impact? But it's relatively. I mean, one's got to be careful about using, saying it's going to be easy. It's not going to be easy, but it's relatively easy and simple compared to something like Mulberry. But again, if you want to turn it into something beyond temporary, then that's a different kettle of fish. You're going to need more engineering capability.
Are the Americans the only country in the world that can do this, or are other armed forces capable of doing the same
I
thing?
would think they're the only ones. We used to have the other thing we used to have was landing ship logistics and landing craft, which were used on D-Day
Mm.
and indeed in the other landings during World War II. And the Americans used a lot of stuff in the Pacific, of course. We don't really have that capability anymore. We tend to use what we call seaports of disembarkation, where we send fairly large ships with all of our equipment to offload in a theatre of operations, be that the Balkans or Iraq or wherever. But we don't have the ability to create this sort of capability. And I think the Americans are probably the only ones who could do it.
That sounds about right. Well, Major General Tim Cross, thank you so much for coming on the show. You're a military logistics expert, and you've been talking to us about this, the start of the American plan to build a temporary port in Gaza in order to get aid and supplies into Gaza.